So good morning, everyone. I'm going to start our meeting here today. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Before I start, I'll request if your mic is on, kindly put it off. Only mine should be on for now. You can put it on back later when if you'd like to ask a question. So kindly mute your mics so that to prevent the background noise. So good morning again. On behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I'm very pleased to forum here. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and I work as a program officer here. The IEA is a public policy think tank, as many of you might know, and our mission is to inform or influence decision-making in Kenya through policy innovation, research, and dialogues. Currently, we work across 5 program areas, including public finance management, economic regulation and competition policy, trade and development, constitutional law and the economy, and futures and foresight. So we are here today on the invitation of the Public Finance Management Program. And as you can see beamed on your screen is the agenda for our meeting. We are going to be discussing the effects of COVID-19 on growth, revenues, and employment. To do that, we have 3 key speakers who I'll introduce as we go. Each of them is going to speak to each of those issues. Basically, how has COVID-19 affected our economic growth rate, affected our revenues, and affected employment in the country. If I could state for a brief, in terms of a brief background, I think we've all heard from different sources the statement that Africa and Kenya, for instance, has been spared or has avoided the scale of basically the scale of infections of the COVID-19. But what has not been clear is that in terms of the effects of our economy. I think for me, pretty much the answer to that is likely to be no, and an obvious no at that, although our 3 speakers will help us provide a justification for whether or not that will be the case. I think at the beginning of the year, the projections for our economic growth rate for this year was set at about 6%, but about a month or so ago, we saw the CS Treasury come in and actually state that they revised the numbers given the situation. So it could be less than that. I think our speakers will also help shed light on that in terms of what the expectations are. So to just start off this discussion and just to be able to provide us with data and evidence regarding how much or to what effect our economy has been affected or is likely to be affected by this COVID, I'm going to invite our 3 speakers to just speak to the issues and help us understand each of these things. And to start us off, I'm going to invite our first speaker, who will talk about employment. What have been the effects of COVID on employment in the country? The first speaker is Dr. Jacob Omolo. He's a lecturer at Kenyatta University, and he'll have about 15 minutes to be able to take us through employment and wages and what effects COVID has had on that. So, Dr. Omolo, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much, colleagues, and also IEA for organizing this forum. As indicated, I am a senior lecturer at Kenyatta University in the Department of Applied Economics. I want to talk about the issue of employment effects of COVID in our economy. So I look at it in terms of the context. Then we look at the employment effects itself, and then lastly we will talk about the policy responses. In the context, actually moving from a point where we are indicating that I think the screen is slow to move. John, I don't know who is controlling it from your side. Yes, that COVID-19 has actually accelerated in intensity and outreach. And of course, we know that many governments, including ours, have put in place some containment measures. These are actually very good, ensuring that we are protected. They also have their negative sides. So, like in many countries, they have full or partial containment measures. Kenya, you have the closure of schools and business. Then limitation in terms of passenger capacity in our public service vehicles, but also in the private vehicles. So these ones are actually causing disruptions in the supply chain, whether you want to look at it from the demand side or from the supply side. Because from the supply side, we know that key supplies cannot be reached in real time, but also the fact that people have lost jobs, the fact that there is reduction in working hours, then it means that people have lost income and they might be affected. 2.7 billion workers have been affected, and in Kenya the estimates are moving towards 2 million, and this is both in the formal and informal. But the most important thing is that it's making workers to be vulnerable to income losses. So we just want to look at the situation that we were in before COVID-19. You can see that in terms of employment proportions, we were highly informal. So you find that the informal sector was actually contributing upwards of 83% of total employment in the country. And then conversely, the formal sector contributing 16.4%. But I just want us to pick some point of clarification here, that when we talk about formal sector, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the jobs there are formal. There are even informal jobs within the formal sector. So then it means that our rate of 83% informal intensity in employment is actually higher when you consider that there are informal jobs within the formal. I want to give an example, a very quick one, that we know very well that we have many workers who are on casual contracts of service, many workers who are part-time, many workers who are actually doing piece rate work, many workers who are on temporary, the ones who have been subcontracted, and the ones who have been outsourced. All those non-standard forms of unemployment, non-standard forms of employment are actually informal jobs within the formal sector. But now also let us look at it in terms of the intensity of casualization just before the COVID-19. So you will find that in the formal sector itself, we had people who are on regular employment, but also those who are on casual employment. Why I am bringing this particular distinction is for us actually to understand that when we say that people are not able to go to work, but we also have people who are on casual contracts of service, then it means that for them not going to work means direct loss of wages and direct loss of livelihoods. So you can see that in 2018 and the figures for 2019 are also just around the same level, is that about a quarter of wage employees in Kenya were on casual contracts of service. Then you also want to move and look at it in terms of the working population by hours worked. You can see that we had quite a number of colleagues who are on part-time. Part-time by definition are those people who are putting in less than 35 hours of work per week. And we have quite a number of them. When you come to the formal sector, there are quite a number. And even if you look at it in terms of industries, like the universities where I come from, you find that we have quite a number of part-time lecturers. And therefore, these people, we are looking at them in terms of people who have lost directly their employment and livelihoods. Then you may also want to look at this now in terms of the effect itself. This is based on data for 2019. And I have just picked a few sectors for illustration. That in 2019, the total formal employment in agriculture, forestry, and fishing was actually 338,600. So we had 338,600 workers who are in agriculture, forestry, and fishing. These are formal or wage employees. Then manufacturing, we had 353,000. Construction, 221.5. If you like, 222,000. Wholesale, retail, trades, 269,000. But then now, if you consider the effect of COVID in terms of reduction in working hours, you also look at it in terms of people who are not able to go to work, then we are projecting a decline of 7.6%. And if you do a decline of 7.6%, the rough estimate would be that in the case of Kenya, we may have lost up to 223,000 in the formal sector. Then the figures are everywhere in the informal sector, because as I said before, our labor market is actually very much informal intensive. And therefore, we have quite a number of colleagues in the informal sector. So for the informal sector, the highest employer there is actually wholesale retail, hotels and restaurants. You can see with up to 9 million workers. Therefore, with the decline, which is even higher, is more than 500,000 workers have actually lost jobs and livelihoods in that particular sector. And you can also see for manufacturing, they have been greatly affected, transport and communication, community and social services, bringing to an estimated total of 1.1 million. So that means that if you were looking at it in the context of the jobs lost, then you would find that we are not talking about anything less than 1.3 million, tending towards 1.4 million. But remember, these could just be the cases that have been reported, because there are a number of things that go on in the labor market which may not necessarily be reported. So then, in terms of this, then you see that employment contraction is actually taking place on a very large scale. There are changes in working hours. There are people who have been made to take unpaid leave because the mandatory paid leave that they have is limited. There are people who could be on sick leave, but they may have already exhausted those particular leave days, and therefore they are considered to be on unpaid leave. I can confirm with certainty that not less than 100 firms have already notified the Ministry of Labor that they want to declare redundancies. And there are also other forms of termination of employment which may not have necessarily been reported. And the casualties, the first casualties, as I said before, are the people who are on casual contracts of service, people who are on temporary forms of employment, the people who are on fixed-term contracts, and those who are on seasonal contracts, or the piece rate workers. Of course, it has been mentioned in the paper several times, and it is actually true that companies have effected pay cuts. Some companies have effected pay cuts, whether through consultation or without consultation. There are pay freezes. I can confirm with certainty that as we are in May, on May 19th, there are actually quite a number of people who have not received even their pay for March, and they are not actually very sure if they will get the pay for April. Then there is also other forms of withholding of pay, and therefore workers actually generally face a high risk of falling into poverty, and there is high doubt that these people will be able to regain their livelihoods post COVID-19. But even if things were to get back to normal, then adjustments within the labor market actually take time to be realized. So you may get adjustments within the economy, but that does not necessarily follow that we shall have adjustments in the labor market. So I want to quickly talk about the policy responses. And for the policy responses, I'm looking at it in terms of 4 pillars. That we need to have pillar 1, which talks about stimulating the economy and employment. So under this pillar 1, of course, you talk about active fiscal policy measures, accommodative monetary policy measures, and maybe lending and financial support to specific sectors of the economy. The sectors of the economy which may have been hard hit. Of course, you cannot leave out the health sector outside. You cannot leave out the tourism sector. You can't leave out the sectors on accommodation and also manufacturing. But as we talk about this, let us also take cognizance of the fact that we have the informal economy, which plays a great role. Then pillar 2 is supporting enterprises, jobs, and income. And in this particular case, we need to actually still emphasize the need for us to have a comprehensive social protection system. So we know that there are sections of the population who are already on some social protection scheme, but extending it to all and making it expanding the register would be very important. Implementing employment retention measures. In many countries, they have come up with wage subsidies or even some subsidies for employers to sustain employment. Then also providing financial or even tax and other reliefs for the enterprises. But now the other pillar is protecting workers in the workplace, because whatever we do, we need to ensure that workers remain safe. So then we talk about strengthening occupational safety and health measures, adapting worker arrangements like the teleworking that we are having, but also taking into account that not all sectors have the capacity to do teleworking. That's why it's about adapting work arrangements, preventing discrimination and exclusion. This discrimination and exclusion that may necessarily come during the COVID and even after COVID is a major issue that we need to consider, and especially if we are to sustain employment and if we are also to sustain productivity. And of course, the issue of providing health access and expanding access to paid leave. Colleagues, you may appreciate the fact that with the review of the labor laws that took place in Kenya in the year 2007, the sick leave period, was actually reduced to 7 days with full pay and another 7 days at half pay. But you can confirm that the period that we have been under, let me call it lockdown, due to COVID, is much more than the 7 days that we are talking about, on the total of 14 days. So that means that people need to get access to statutory paid leave days. Then the other pillar is actually promoting social dialogue. And here is actually to do with strengthening the capacity of workers, employers, and also their organizations, strengthening social dialogue in terms of collective bargaining and labor relations institutions, and also processes. So those, in my view, are things that we can look at, and depending on the situation, you can look at it from a short-term perspective, a medium-term perspective, and also the long-term perspective. So those are the things that I have, and therefore I want to thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Molo, for that presentation. He's helped us understand some of the effects or likely effects of the COVID on employment, looking at both the formal and informal sectors. He's talked about contraction of jobs and various policy responses that could follow to address or mitigate some of those effects. Now, I'd like you to note down any questions you have for each of our speakers. We also have a chat box on this platform. You can use that. Kindly send in your questions, stating who you'd like to address the question, and our speakers can begin to look at them as we go. So please utilize the chat box to ask your questions before we get to plenary, although we'll also have an actual Q&A. I see a hand up, but I think we'll respond to that during plenary. So for now, kindly ask your questions on the chat. So we'll now go to our second presentation. We've looked at, also please mute your mic. Thank you. So we'll go to the second presentation, looking at the effect of COVID on public revenues. And to do this, we have the speaker is a member of the IEA. He's one of my colleagues, Mr. John Mutua. John is our programs coordinator at the IEA and also currently heads our public finance management program. He's going to be looking at the effects of COVID on public revenue and expenditure. John, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. So as she has mentioned, I'll take us through the effects of COVID on public revenue. It's just basically on fiscal policy, so public revenue and expenditure. So in terms of outline, so I'll just mention our context in terms of where we were, looking at both the revenue side and the expenditure side, what is called the fiscal position or the fiscal health of the country pre-COVID, and the effect of COVID and the containment measures or the responses to COVID on this position, and then just a bit of the outlook for 2020, financial year 2020-2021, and of course conclude with some key messages. Now, in terms of our fiscal position pre-COVID, and I think, of course, Omola alluded to this, so I will not get into the details of this. So our economic growth or GDP actually slowed down or reduced from 6.3% in 2018 to 5.4% in 2019. This was largely attributed to underperformance in agriculture and private consumption, despite some resilience from the service sector. Then by December 2019, revenue performance, obviously, we've been missing the target. That has been a song that Kenyans have been confronted with. Of course, we've been missing the revenue targets, but for the first 2 quarters of 2019-2020 financial year, we've seen some improvement in revenue collection. And some of these improvements are attributed to some increased collection from dividends dividends from parastatals. And then on the revenues expenditure side, we have some rationalization measures, austerity measures and the like. Now, in relation to this fiscal consolidation path or agenda was actually, at least for 2019, the way we were moving as a country, we were almost headed, we were heading towards the 2019, and that's supposed to be 2020 target of 6.3. In 2018, between 2017, 18, 2018, 19, we were in the range of 7 to 8%. But the way we were performing in the first half or the first 3 quarters of the year before COVID, at least the government was on this path of headed towards meeting the target. Then in terms of debt distress risk, it's actually moderate, and I will get into that later. Now, upon the emergence of COVID, of course, we've seen a couple of responses from the government, and the one that I will focus on is fiscal policy responses. And these responses are actually, we have the tax relief measures. So the president actually ascended to the tax amendment bill, I think early April, I guess. And we also have responses that are actually tied to, that are expenditure related in terms of strengthening healthcare systems. There was a relaxation of fiscal policy in order to provide room for government to spend towards responding to this disease and stuff like that. So I'll focus on this. Of course, we had some monetary and but I'm not. Now, in terms of understanding the effects of COVID on revenue, so we have this formula of aggregate demand, and some of it was actually mentioned by Omolo in terms of how our revenues may be affected. So no doubt, if you look at this formula, aggregate demand is actually a function of several factors: consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, which is export minus imports. Now, the arrows show that, of course, there will be a decline in aggregate demand, and I will explain this. Now, given the containment measures, so we'll have loss of jobs, or we are currently experiencing loss of jobs, incomes. There's an erosion of wealth. So if you look at the stock exchange, the value of most of these stocks have been going down. So basically, consumption is declining. Investment, the same effect because of uncertainties and wait and see mode. And then net export, supply chain disruptions. We're experiencing now border closures. There's also a fall in global demand for exports. So all these are leading to a decline in decline in the 3 variables. And in contrast, for government expenditure, in order for government to be able to enforce the various containment measures, then it's going to spend more, and it's currently spending more. So those in total collectively will lead to a decline in aggregate demand, and this actually has an effect, negative effect on the revenues that we expect to collect. Now, if you look at the various tax relief measures, and we had, as I hear, we had a webinar on this. There were actually 5 key tax relief measures. And so what I've done, I've listed the 5. We have the targeted beneficiaries, and then I've compared pre-COVID period, what was collected in 2018-19, 2019-20. The 2019-20 is what was estimated to be collected from the these tax components, and what is estimated for 2020-2021. So we already have the estimates from the National Treasury estimates of revenue, and then I subtracted that to get the difference. Now, as I hear, we are not able to compute what would be the estimated revenue losses from these tax relief measures. But you can compare what Parliament Budget Office has done, and the last column is the World Bank computation of the revenue losses. So they have some models that they use to, based on various assumptions, they use to compute the revenues that will be lost based on the different tax reliefs. So the first one is basically a reduction of corporate income tax from 30% to 25%, and the target there is for more farms, companies basically. And you can see already what is projected to be lost from that. Then we have the reduction of turnover tax from 3% to 1%. The target there is medium and small scale enterprises. Then on VAT, reduction from 16 to 14%, targeting general public. The idea there is to boost consumption. So this actually from the estimate of revenue, what they project to collect in 2020-2021 is 481.6 from VAT. And the difference from the previous year is that this will go up by 69 billion. However, again, for all these tax reliefs, there are two effects. There is the effect of subdued economic activity that will lead to a reduction in revenue collection, and the other effect is based on the reduction in the tax rate. However, for both PBO, Parliament Budget Office, and the World Bank, they show that we will have a loss of 49.6 billion and 13.8 billion respectively. Then with regard to pay as you earn, there were two measures, one targeting 100% relief actually for all the people earning 24,000 shillings per month. So all the people earning that amount will not pay any income tax. And then the second one was targeted towards the top income tax band, so a reduction from 30 to 25%. And again, there you can see what is estimated in terms of by the National Treasury. The collection will go down by 18.4, and then you can see the estimation of revenue losses by the two institutions. To sum that up, this chart actually shows, and you can see the trend there is a downward trend. So printed estimate is what was estimated in the beginning of the for the 2019-2020 budget. Now, by the time we had the COVID, the budget was revised. So we have supplementary budget, and it shows that the revenue, ordinary revenue, this is revenue from the 4 income tax bands, that's tax components, that's income tax, VAT, customs duty, and excise duty. So that is projected was revised downwards to 1.6 trillion. But by 30th of March, quarter 3, we had collected 1.2 trillion. But then what is projected for 2020-2021 is 1.6 trillion. And again, the chart actually shows that picture. So collection by, this is a comparison between the target and the actual revenue collections by quarter. And you can see for 2019, of course, we don't have the 4th quarter because that has not been, we have not come to the end of the financial year. Now, there are a few emerging issues from this in terms of the tax relief measures. So one of the things that we notice that, or the question that we're asking, as much as, yes, there's we are expecting some revenue losses from these tax reliefs because of the two effects that I mentioned. Given that the VAT has been reduced and we have some disposable income that has gone up, what we do not know is whether indeed people will consume more based on increased disposable income and reduction in VAT, or whether they will save, given anticipated high future taxes. Then the other thing that is not clear is in regard to the tax relief measures, the design. So there's a study that was done by the World Bank, and the study shows that, for instance, on the proposal to reduce pay as you earn for the top income tax bracket from 25 to 30, this is actually benefiting the very top of the income tax bracket, and is actually a regressive tax. So it actually goes against the principles of good tax tax, in the sense that income tax is progressive, but in this case, it's actually ending up benefiting the very rich. So in terms of design, that's actually not a good way to design this. Then the other thing that we note is obviously that in Kenya we have about just under 3 million personal income taxpayers, and so this implies that the tax reliefs that were approved by the president will not benefit the majority who are in the informal sector. Then there are also questions around sunset clause. The tax relief measures, it's not clear whether they are temporary or for how long they will run. So this is something that is supposed to be made clear. And we don't know whether we are going to revert back to the old tax rates that we had when the situation improves. And the final one is that, of course, the finance bill proposes to remove some VAT exemptions, which may offset some of the losses. But again, this is based on whether it will be passed by the National Assembly. Now, looking at the expenditure side, the budget was revised, and so we had supplementary budget 1, and supplementary budget 2 was actually in response to COVID. And if you look at the supplementary budgets, there are 4 items, about 5, there are actually more, but I've just listed some of the areas where the budget was revised in order to provide funds to, for instance, on health, to strengthen the health systems in terms of salaries, allowances for medical personnel, isolation centers, PPP, etc. There is the cash transfer in terms of, so you have the social protection, an estimate of about 10 billion that will be used towards that. Pending bills clearance, 13.8 billion. Again, some of these estimations have consolidated or picked this from various sources. There is also money that is expected to be saved from expenditure rationalization. So we have realignment of capital expenditure, postponement of some low priority projects, and of course we have the salary cuts for president and some select senior public officers. But for this, we are not able to, at this time, estimate how much will be saved from that. These are just examples of where, for instance, the money going towards strengthening the health system. So you have the Ministry of Health, the amendments there, or the revision of the budget. So I've circled that in red. So you can see Kenya COVID Emergency Response Project. Then again, from the Ministry of Health, there's a reduction of universal health coverage. The money that was allocated to rolling out that was actually diverted to respond, about 9.4 billion to respond to COVID-19. Now, so going to 2020, 2021, and in the medium term, what will the picture, the fiscal position or health of the country look like? Of course, it may worsen given the projection of GDP and the fact that we are likely to continue to experience subdued economic growth, and of course there are certain lag effects that as a country, or residual effects that will continue to experience in the better part of this year and next year, even after recovering from the post-COVID situation. And you can see this is just the growth rate. What Jackie had mentioned was initially revised, GDP was revised downwards to 3%, but later again, because of COVID, revised even further to about 1%. So these again are comparison for Kenya's GDP projections for 2020 and its peers. The situation on the in terms of deficit will actually worsen. We were headed into realizing the 6.3% target, but this will not be met because we are going to spend more, and again, we are experiencing challenges in terms of revenue collection. The debt, the overall risk in terms of debt distress actually is going to worsen from moderate to high. And so in terms of key messages, there's need again for the government to continue focusing more on expenditure rationalization and expenditure cuts across board, especially on non-priority areas in terms of travel, whether local or foreign and stuff like that. There's need to reverse the tax relief measures for us as a country to continue in the path of fiscal consolidation. And the other point to note is that there's need to utilize evidence. For instance, the design of the tax relief on the top taxable income band rate, this is actually not going to benefit, it's only going to benefit the very rich. So this is not a good design. And so there's need to ensure that whenever we are coming up or the government is coming up with these measures, that they utilize or they should be informed as much as possible by evidence. And the final one is, of course, there is need for debt restructuring. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, John, for that elaborate presentation. John has helped us understand the effects of the COVID-19 on our public revenues. He's shared an elaborate presentation, basically looking at our revenue performance over the years, which we were already missing targets, as he stated previously. And he's helped us understand some of the key drivers that are likely to affect our revenues in terms of performance. And he's talked about our consumption, investments, government expenditure, and net exports. He's then gone on to project in terms of the tax relief measures that were provided recently and how that is likely to affect our revenues, basically looking at the 4 classifications of the tax relief that was enacted into law. And then he's helped us understand key projections in terms of our economic growth as we for the next year, for the foreseeable future. And then he's also talked about emerging issues. I'll still urge us to note down any questions that we have for all our presenters, so that when we come to plenary, it will be quick and easy. So that was a summary for John's presentation. We go now to our last presentation. We've looked at the effects on employment. We've looked at the effects on public revenues. And now we are going to look at the effects of COVID on our growth rates. To do this presentation, or to make this presentation, we'll have Mr. Kwame Owino. Kwame is our Chief Executive Officer at the IEA, and he's also a renowned economist and a familiar face to most of you, if not all. So I'll invite Kwame to make the presentation. Kwame, you're welcome.
Okay.
Just before you invite Kwame, can you open the chat, because it seems to be available to team members
only? Yeah, please.
It doesn't accept any chats at all. Just to alert you about that. Super chat.
Thanks, Churchill. Sorry about that. We'll handle that as they make the presentation. Thanks. Kwame, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've had presentations on the effects of COVID-19, the early effects of COVID-19 on the emergency on employment. And John has taken us through some fiscal implications. So what I'm talking about is just to talk about the macroeconomy in general and to say what it means for overall value addition in the economy, which is basically GDP, and then to come back to what it means for welfare and incomes, and then finally some quick responses based on policy responses that we think government could take at this time. So next slide, please. Okay, now the background is that even before the COVID-19 emergency came with us, I think there were issues in the public affairs regarding the economy, and one of them obviously was public debt. John has talked about it, and among the things that concerned us was the tenor of the public debt, in the sense that the tenor of debt was shortening while the payments were getting bigger. Therefore, debt service as a share of revenues and overall risk of debt sustainability was rising. And then we had the exchange rate risk, which is basically that slightly above 50% of Kenya's debt by 2018 were owed to foreigners, meaning that basically that has an implication for how many dollars we'd have to get to be able to pay that debt. So there's an exchange rate risk in the sense that if the exchange rate depreciates for any reason, then it means the quantum of debt in Kenya shillings expands. And then, of course, the other one was basically private investment. We had a problem attracting private investment. That should be attracting private investments. And then we had a huge number of government projects that had stalled, and some were frozen, not freezed. So for that reason, if you put together the total effects of all these, investment in Kenya, whether it was the political economy of the Kenyan elections, as we'll see later, the elections period actually went much, much better than many people anticipated, in the sense that it was a long drawn-out election, but its shock effects on the economy immediately was not as pronounced. Next slide. So we start here by seeing the trends in Kenya's economic growth over the last 5 years. And as you can see, it's been steady growth, well above 5%, with the exception of 2017, which was 4.8. But the rest of the time, the economy has been growing, keeping pace, and above population growth rate of about 2.1% per year. Because of that, GDP at market prices was also growing. And 2015, Kenya's GDP was 6.28. Kenya's GDP was Kenya's GDP was 2.8 million. Kenya's GDP was 2.8 million. 6.28 billion. And it's grown all the way to, at the end of 2019, it was 9.74. So basically what you see is growth rates are associated, obviously, with increasing the size of Kenya's gross domestic product. And what you see in the third column, the third row, is a difference in what that's telling you is a new value added in the economy for that year. And so you can see it's been massive. So the value added in 2016, based on the difference between the growth rates in those 2 years, was 738 billion Kenya shillings. And then it's 1.1 trillion, 726, and 848. So what you see is that growth rates together, growth rates are essential for how much value is created, because that value added in billions of shillings is what actually amounts to incomes, and it's related to employment as well. So that's the background up to 2019. Now, yes, just go to the next slide. Yes. So now if you look at this slide 36, what this slide tells us is we are taking the baseline as the year 2019 and asking ourselves that based on the shock that has come from the COVID-19 emergency, and remember the COVID-19 emergency is not the only issue that Kenya had in the economy. Other things were coming, but basically what it means is that there's a convergence of all those factors, the debt factors, the growth without creation of jobs, and all that, all those together. Now, if you look at the second column, basically we're assuming certain projections in growth rates. Now, initially, the one in green was the initial projection by the Treasury and the central bank. There was an agreement that at the beginning of January, 6.2%. After COVID came in, I think at the end of March, there was an adjustment to 2.3. The red one is basically the growth projections by the regional economic outlook published by the IMF at the end of March, when it became clear that COVID would be more pervasive and a pandemic was declared. And the 0.8 is what the projections by the IMF in its lending note to government 2 weeks ago showed. So basically what this tells you is 6.8 was what was expected before. And then an adjustment of 2.3 was the adjustment that was made by the government, the central bank specifically, when it adjusted by saying that, yes, there's going to be pervasive effects. The 1.01 was the effects that the IMF forecast, and then this was 0.8 is basically the adjustment after it became clear about what would happen. Now, all those four present scenarios. I think the one that is least probable now is 6.2, which was the total one because it's been adjusted. But as you see in the third column, what it tells you is what the projected size of Kenya's GDP would be if the growth rate had been 6.2%, so it would have been 10.3. And if it went down to 0.8, the total GDP would be 9.8 billion, 9.8 trillion shillings over time. So you can see that the four scenarios tell us that we are somewhere between 10.3 trillion to 9.8 for this year alone. And the final final column here tells you again what the difference, or rather what the new value created would have been, which should be basically a positive effect. So what it's telling you is that if Kenya had continued, if the country had maintained the 6.2%, which was the forecast one, almost a consensus forecast between the Treasury and the central bank, and which was initially used as the basis for the budget policy statement issued in in February, then we'd have had an additional gain, which is additional value added created in Kenya of 603 billion shillings over the 12 months. And what that tells you is that that would be equivalent to an additional value created in Kenya of 50 billion shillings per month, which is around about 1.5 billion. This is additional. This is not the only one. This is in addition to what other value would be created. This is the additional 603 billion based on that. And of course, as you can see, it goes down to 224 at 2.3%, which means it would be 18 billion created per month. At 1.01, it would be 8 billion created per month, and at 0.8, it would be about 6.4. Now, what this tells you is how the impact and the importance of growth, and I think no economist can overemphasize that, the importance of growth in increasing human welfare. Remember these losses, these gains actually, each of them would be a gain relative to the baseline of 2018, but you can tell how growth rates matter for how much value is created, and how that value then, if you split that value across the population and sectors, it certainly matters. That between 6.2 to 0.8 growth, you actually have an additional 600 billion of value that is created or not created. And the point that is important for us to note right now is that difference is not difference that can be recovered. So for instance, by crashing growth from 6.2 to 2.3, it means that some 400 billion worth of value that could have been created will not be created regardless, and it's not something that can be recovered. So I think that's the important thing to see across these four scenarios. Next slide. Now, so that's overall growth. Now, this slide 37 tells us about, again, only a first column on the left, you see what the income per capita would be. So that's the total income per person in Kenya in 2018. That's the total income per person in Kenya in 2019. And then if you place that again into a box and ask yourself, if we had grown at 6.2%, what would be the projected GDP per capita, income per capita per person, based on population growth and based on the 6.2%. So of course, population growth is taken as 2.2, so it's a standard. But as you can see again in those colors, blue represents what the forecast, the consensus is right now between Treasury and the central bank. The red is what the focus is from the original regional economic outlook published by the IMF in March. And then the 0.8 is what the latest consensus, the latest IMF forecast was based on the money that they lent to government, the $750 million that they lent to government 2 weeks ago. So again, what you see in the final column, and I think this is an important thing to bear in mind, is what it means for income. So if you look at it, the green chart, or rather the green numbers tell you what the numbers would have been if the 6.2% would have been. So it means that the average income per Kenyan would have been about 212,000 shillings. Now that's income over 12 months, which brings it down to just slightly less than 20,000 per person per year. Yes, that's just how bad it is in our country. 204 is what we expect now based on the consensus forecast. And then of course 202. Now why these numbers matter is this. If we had maintained 6.2%, and then income had grown to 212,000. What that means is that it would be taking us just 17 years for that income to double. The green forecast tells you that had Kenya continued to grow at 6.2% and maintained that growth level, maintained the same population growth level, then it was going to take us only, 17 years for that income to double from 212 to about 415 per person. The 2.3 means virtually, it's just about the same. Remember, it's 2.3% growth, but our population is growing at 2.1%, which means the real population growth rate, the real growth per person would be just about stagnant. So we'd maintain about 204. You can see 204, and this is also 204 with a few hundreds on top. If that growth rate is maintained, what that means is that we are basically in stagnation. What I'm trying to tell you is how important growth rates are and why this COVID-19 emergency has effects for poverty reduction on one side, and also people's welfare generally. So at 2.3% for Kenya's growth, it means we are just stagnant. So basically, that's what economists call stagnation. At 1.01 and 0.8, actually what will be happening, as you can see, is there'll be secular decline, meaning that even with growth at those rates, what happens effectively to people's incomes is you're in decline. You're declining. Why? Because your population growth rate at 1.01 is twice as high as your economic growth. And at 0.8, again, the economy is growing much, much slower, and basically you're in decline. So 1.02 and 0.8 are actually decline, 2.3 is stagnation, and 6.2 is what it takes you 17 years to double. And obviously to grow at the rates that people require, you'd actually have to bring it to a point where your income would have to actually double in 15 years for us to meet the Vision 2030 objectives. So next. Now, this is a representation of those same charts. So basically what you're telling you here is that 2020 to 2023, based on the projections from government documents, National Treasury projections before the virus came in, and then CBK projections as well, based on their last meeting. And the final one is if we had a slow rebound. Now, so the first one assumes that there was no growth rate without the virus, which is the blue line right at the top. The second one is if we have a quick rebound, which means that we grow at the consensus rate today, but then Kenya rebounds quickly and we begin to recover, which means we just have like 1/2 or 1/4 of the year affected. And after that, you recover to 4% and then 5.4, and then we maintain. Now, what I want you to see is the fact that the gap between those two curves, or the gap between those three curves, represents the lost growth potential, which is not recovered. And then you've seen in the previous chart what that means for people's welfare. So at 2.3 and 1, it's just telling you what, how much more would have to be done for recovery to take place. But it's telling you that if you go to 1, the likelihood that you'll be reaching 8 by 2023 is just 0, or very, very slow. It's a very, very small one. So that gap between 6.2 and 1, and remember, it's carried over. So the difference in 1 year is carried over to, so the cumulative effect is what these charts show you. Again, this simply emphasizes why we need a quick rebound. A slow rebound would not be ideal, even if obviously it tells you that obviously the goals for poverty and the goals for actually attaining Vision 2030 get even further behind us if we do not rebound quickly. Next slide. This is a summary of what we've just spoken about, and what it's telling us is basically, so if you look at the chart on your left column, which is basically GDP without virus and GDP or quick rebound, this is what we've represented in the chart that we've seen before, so that without a virus, quick rebound, rather, if you have a quick rebound, it would be, GDP would grow from 9.96 trillion in 2020 and get to 11.58 trillion. All that within the 3 years. GDP without virus would have grown from 10.3 to 12 trillion in 2023. What that's telling you is that the ability to absorb a shock or actually to evade it is an essential part of what macroeconomic management should be about. Now, the final columns tell you what the losses would be if a quick rebound came. You'd still have losses. And the cumulative losses, which is the last column, tells you what the cumulative losses by those gaps that we saw would be a 3.3 trillion loss, which is equivalent to 28% of 2019 gross domestic product. Now, what I'm trying to let you know is to quantify what the effects of those losses are because of this shock. Now, remember, this shock is not only in COVID-19, even if everybody's giving, including corporations and government itself, giving the impression that COVID-19 is responsible for these shocks. Some of these shocks are all a mixture of macroeconomic management before, and then when they converge with a shock of such as this, which is, start with a health shock, which makes it necessary to switch off the economy by social distancing and closing business for a while. That's the effect. Now, we're not saying that this means that closing the economy was bad. We are simply saying that the status, the foundation, where you start is essential for how quickly we can recover. If we have a slow rebound, then the losses would be equivalent to 37% of 2019 GDP, which means our losses would be equivalent to as if people did not work for 40% of the year based on the 2019 GDP. So I think this is why it's essential for how government responds to be right in our minds as we think about how quickly we transit, or the economy, Kenyans transit from this situation. This next slide. Now, so we are drawing scenarios here in terms of income losses in the medium term. You remember we talked about the short term. Now we want to talk about the medium term, which is the next 3 to 4 year horizon. Now, so the first column again is GDP per capita without the virus, which was the growth rate of 6.2%. And it's telling you that in 4 years, Kenya's income would have grown from 212,000. Remember, this is annual income per person, from 212,000 to 246, so about 2,250. A quick rebound. It would come from 204 to 222, which means that in 2023, based on the quick rebound, you'd just be at the place where you would be in 2021, which means you're losing 2 years of growth of value. Because if you can look at GDP per capita, the final column in 2023 for the quick rebound, which is the middle one, you are equivalent in 2023 to where you'd be at the end of 2021. And then, of course, the slow rebound would be significant in the sense that you're basically stagnation. You're just at the point where, you're assuming that you rebound, you're basically just slightly above, which means at that point, for a quick, slow rebound, the total income per person at the end of 2023 would be less than what the income would be at the end of 2021 under the quick rebound, or rather under the no COVID effect in 2020. Now, these scenarios are meant to just let us know what the added value would be and what it means for us to, for the country to actually shift gears quickly and ensure that we have a quick a recovery as quickly as is possible. Final. So basically, the policy responses, you can tell, are almost clear. I think the first one is the public health response. Questions are asked about how quickly we can come back and people can go back to work. Everybody is raring to go, and I think every Kenyan wants us to go, but there are difficulties. I think what concerns us at the Institute of Economic Affairs is that if you look at the fact that yesterday, the total number of tests conducted are still less than 50,000, meaning that we have tested, even if you assume that those tests are carried out on different people, and they're not, some of them are repeat tests for the same guy, it means that we've tested less than 1% of the total population. With that kind of slow testing or no test, I am not sure that you can read the numbers as saying we are in control, or you can actually tell what the trajectory of the infections are. That's the unfortunate thing. So we can't even assess what the surge capacity is, and we cannot even tell whether the curve is being flattened or not. That's the unfortunate thing that makes us very, very nervous. So that's the first thing. I think what we need is basically for government to actually lift and to start to actually go through mass testing. Mass testing. Now, mass testing is not the same as simply going to Kawangware because you've had a few places and testing 200 people in a day. Mass testing would mean randomized testing of the population over time to actually understand from a representative sample of the population how far this virus has gone and to understand the patterns of its of transmission, whether community transmission is taking place or not, because that's what we need to stop. So that's the first. The second one is, look, there is a shock to the economy based on the fact that yes, there's a difference. I mean, people can't go to work for good reasons. People can't go to work. And it's also important for people to stay away to prevent social interactions, which are essential for the economic, for the performance of, for people to do their jobs, whether in formal sector, even in the formal sector, as Dr. Molo told us. For as long as we do not have a fund that supports small and micro enterprises specifically, that have seen the shock, to be able to keep their workers in, my fear is that there are businesses that would be lost. And even if we have a quick rebound, they would not recover, and they're responsible for that gap that we saw between the quick rebound and as if we had no shock. So for as long as there's no lifeline fund that allows businesses to be able to keep their workers in place, it is possible that many businesses may be so eroded that even if we recover quickly, most of those people would still suffer significant difficulties because businesses would have been completely damaged. Then the community safety nets. I think government has started a form of community safety nets, but basically, and the right way is actually what government has done, which is to use M-Pesa to send money so that people are able to determine their own purchases as opposed to distributing food. Physical distribution of food is not just expensive, it's not efficient, because what we need right now is actually to disperse money very quickly. Now, because government at least knows through poverty statistics which people are most vulnerable, the idea that you're still finding out who are the most vulnerable doesn't make sense to us. The kind of shock that the economy has suffered requires speed. I know many people are very concerned about accuracy. The point is, I don't think government is getting the accuracy side well. Most importantly, you can actually tell from people's transactions where the bulk of the vulnerable population are. They tend to be female-headed households in arid and semi-arid areas, and in some places in urban conglomerations. We know where we can find them. Those people are not difficult to find, and transferring money to them, however little, is essential. I think we need regulatory flexibility, and regulatory flexibility should also come with, even including in the part of healthcare. I think that government needs mass testing. One of the things we need to do is to provide an incentive for people to design testing systems or testing mechanisms that do not require whether KBS, I mean Kenyan Bureau of Standards, to actually have to examine through months and months and months whether a test works, what are its default rates and everything else, because testing is essential. So if you have regulatory flexibility, it can be provided for this time to allow for any test to come and for some regulations to be eased because we are dealing with a significant emergency. In our view, the biggest thing is actually it's as if you're dealing with a natural disaster. If you had a natural disaster, maintaining very strict rules might not necessarily be helpful, partly because you actually delay the response. Debt renegotiation, I think that's important. And obviously, the IMF note mentions it, and government itself is also seeking to renegotiate debt to actually expand the tenure so that you have some relief. And this is essential because if you understand, this year government intends to raise up, I think, about 1.7 trillion shillings, 980 trillion shillings, 980 billion, more than half of the money that's coming to government this year in income taxes, in revenues, actually is going to be used to redeem debt. Now, the IE had anticipated this a couple of years back. Here we are. And I think it's a very, very difficult position that government is in. Our view is that a debt renegotiation is necessary because without debt renegotiation and expanding of the tenure, government might be unable to pay salaries very soon, and that's a scary prospect. Of course, there's improved. I think we require improved and more clear parliamentary scrutiny of funds, the COVID emergency funds, but also other government funds, and how government is using procurement rules right now to buy new things. And the final one is just innovative policy choices. And here we have one idea. It's not peculiar to us, but I think Kenyans are scared of tests, and part of the reason they're scared of tests is what it would mean if they proved to be positive one way or the other. That's the first one. And secondly, we are not exhausting capacity. As I said, in 60 plus days since we had the first COVID-19 case on the 13th of March, the country has tested less than 1% of the population. In order for us to be able to open up without a fear that there'll be a surge in infections and that people might be, we need to understand what share of the population has it. That's one. Two, an innovative policy is necessary because of one factor. One, 6% of people above the age of 65 are the ones who are most affected because 6% of people above 60 die or face severe consequences when they get the virus. COVID. I mean, when they become ill, which means they're COVID-19, they suffer from COVID-19. It's less than 1 in 1,000 people for people between the ages of 1 to about 40, and 40 and above, it comes down to about 1 in 100. Now that tells you where the risk is, and partly why, as Kenya, we've been saved from a surge in infections. I think managing risks based on age and a policy that is responsive to that age the demographic profile of these countries is essential. My view is that government should actually encourage people who are 60 and above to stay home for at least another 3 months. If it means paying them, I think we should, because as we've seen, the payoff would be extremely large. In some cases, basically, you're talking about a difference of 800 billion shillings, and that's 800 billion shillings in a year. So basically, if we can spend 100 billion to keep people who are most at risk to stay at home, and then test the rest of the population to ensure that they do not pass it to the elderly people, that would be useful. But the more important one is an idea I've been playing with, which is basically to actually give Kenyans the courage to test. And one of the ways to test that is to put a lottery. Kenyans like lotteries. And to say, look, if you test, your name goes into a lottery, and maybe every month you might win a couple of thousand shillings. We saw it with the sports betting and all these other things. I know Kenyans have our own moral views about betting, but the most important thing is that from our calculation, if you had a weekly prize of 1 million shillings, hoping to put in people, and 1 in 1,000 people could win, you can actually make sure that you test the entire population within 3 months and spend only 47 million shillings. And if you spend 47 million shillings, it means you've crowded in people for 1 shilling per person. Why? By using a prize and an incentive for people to test as it is today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that presentation, Kwame. Very interesting submissions there. So Kwame's presentation, just to recap quickly, has looked at the trend in Kenya's economic growth rate. He's helped us understand what that means in terms of real value when we talk about projected shift from 6% to of our economic growth rate to about less than 1%. What does that mean in terms of real value? He's then gone on to discuss projections for our economic growth in the medium term, again helping us understand what that means in terms of real value and what those losses, the projected losses, would translate to. Then he's looked at his urgent policy responses that could help to facilitate the quick rebound, which I believe should be the best case scenario. So, and looking at that, he's made some policy proposals to help us address that, talking about the Lifeline Fund, which would aid small businesses, debt renegotiations, and he's concluded with innovative policy choices. So I think we've heard from all our presenters now. So, and we apologize for the chat option. It seems inactive and we've tried to reactivate it, but we seem to have a small problem. So kindly bear with us. We'll now go to the plenary session. And for this, I'll invite you to, if you have a question to ask, you can unmute your microphone, or you can also raise your hand and I'll see it. Then I'll be able to queue the questions. But before then, just unmute your mic, ask your question, state the person to whom you'd like to address that question, and then we'll take a few, then we'll come back for another round. So to begin with, I see Kefa's hand. I had also seen Odanga, so we'll start with Kefa. Kefa, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yes. Good morning. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, you are.
Yes, my name is Kefa Muirore, usually with Citizen Business. Just 2 questions. This in particular, specific to Jacob. We've seen the casualizations of job.
Sorry, have we lost you? Kefa? I think we seem to have lost Kefa. Before he comes back, Wahisi, you can ask your question.
Thank you, and thank you for those wonderful presentations, and the information shared is really good insights. I've 2 questions to John, and one is the aspect of fiscal consolidation now because of COVID-19, and the question is what could the effect of that be on the Big Four agenda, implementation of the Big Four agenda, and in terms of service delivery to Kenyans? And then two, he mentioned the aspect of there's need for reverse of tax relief measures. I didn't understand what that meant because you see this, as going through the presentations, COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 is likely to be here for the next like 1.5 years, depending on whether we rebound or not. So we might still need those tax relief measures to cushion the economy. And then lastly, the aspect of public debt. Yes, I agree with most of the sentiments, but in the medium term or currently in the interim period, how will we deal with the aspect of debt service, given that revenue is going to really decline? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Wahisi. Kenneth Owocha, you can ask your question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My question, before I ask a question to Dr. Molo, I'd like to put across that one of the contributors of this effect of COVID-19 is because of the government's initiatives like keeping social distance. So this implies that people are no longer free to do whatever they were doing. Now, to Dr. Molo, I listened carefully about your presentation and saw you are really painting a grim picture of the effect of COVID-19 in employment. So the question is that, is there anything positive that has come up with this COVID-19, or everything is just negative? Thanks.
Thanks, Kenneth. We go to the next person, Odanga. I had seen your hand much earlier. Kindly proceed to ask your question.
Hello.
Yes.
Hey, Jackie. Thanks a lot for the presentation, guys. I really enjoyed seeing the stats that came out. I just have a question on, or rather, three questions, or rather. The first one is about I think to Jacob, about the inequalities of the effects that are going to be incurred during this period. Do we have any evidence that is coming out of the gender defects that, there are a lot of people who are calling this the she session, that quite a number of jobs that were, or rather had a significant share of female workers could experience the highest amounts of attrition. So I'm wondering if there are any possible indicators as to how that could be going on, and are there any other aspects of inequality that we expect to see? So how are the rich weathering this storm? How are the middle class weathering this storm? And of course, how is the BOP going to weather through this storm? And then I think my second question also goes to Kwame. I think when we're talking about the whole idea of keeping the vulnerable in society, basically you mentioned specifically those who are 60 and above, keeping them from going to work. But I think a lot of public health officers are talking about our comorbidities burden, the fact that we are not really yet sure about what happens when COVID-19 interacts with HIV, tuberculosis, and a whole bunch of other things. So I wonder if you can just address what that possibly will look like, especially given that our HIV burden is very much predominant amongst the youth. And then I think, and the third question, I think perhaps I can take it back to Jacob. I think also the previous person who just asked a question before me has raised that point, which is that, the informal sector tends to act as a shock absorber for a lot of people who lose their jobs in the formal sector. But I mean, there are stories of resilience, so, how possibly could we see this playing out as well? Because, we are seeing a lot of people who you've lost your job, so you start deciding to deliver maybe food or some stuff like that. So I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Thanks, Madung, for that. I'll go to the next person, Agustino Achando.
Hello, guys.
Yes, proceed.
Thank you. It has been a powerful session. I've enjoyed listening to the speakers. it was worth sparing time for. Maybe my question, I'll pose it to Daktari. I wanted to ask, can the employers that are affected by the coronavirus crisis postpone any new recruit start date or withdraw a job offer? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Agostino. We'll have two more. Then I'll invite our speakers to respond before we come back for a second round. So, Eric, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the revenue collection that he talks about. We understand that the government is losing a lot of revenue. There's a lot of leakages. What kind of policy, what policy measures can be put in place to help the government so that they can be able to collect the revenues, or they can be able to seal the leakages that steal the revenue from government? Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Eric. And finally, Sharon, you can ask your question.
Thanks to the panelists and everybody for the presentation. My question is in regards to the debt situation. I'm wondering whether there's any wiggle room in terms of negotiating or delaying debt payments, and if that kind of negotiation would actually give some room for government to redirect those funds. I mean, even private companies, for example, are starting to rely on their force majeure clauses. Is government also in a similar position to negotiate with its lenders?
Okay, thanks, Sharon. So I'll invite our speakers to respond, and I'll start with Dr. Omolo. Kindly respond to the questions that have been posed to you. You can start by telling us whether there's anything positive that could have come out of COVID-19, or is it all doom and gloom? So, Karibu, Daktari.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie, and also colleagues for the issues of clarification that you have raised. Yeah, I think it's a valid concern that the tone is that there is everything negative. I'm looking at it in terms of the net effect, because of course every situation comes with both positive and negative sides of it. But for COVID, the net effect is that it will be negative, because we appreciate the fact that there are some manufacturing enterprises that are actually going on with their businesses, and especially the ones that are able to manufacture the essential products that we are using. We also know that the reduction in VAT, as indicated by government, may have benefited some people, but if you were to look at it, then the trickle-down effect has not yet happened. I imagine that the people who are in this particular platform may not have realized any significant reduction in the prices of goods and services that they consume, even as much as there was a reduction in VAT from 16% to 14%. The reduction in the pay as you earn, the capping from 30% to 25%, yes, it has gone to a few individuals, but what is the proportion of those individuals to the total? And even if you look at it in terms of the waiver, the pay as you earn waiver for those people who are earning up to 24,000, how many are they? And were they actually within the tax bracket previously? So that we could actually say that they have benefited. There is the social protection safety nets that have been put in place by the government. This is the transfers that are going to the elderly, the orphans and vulnerable children, the people with severe disabilities, and those who are in the arid and semi-arid areas. But the other question is, yes, that one has come in, but overall, does it actually now tell us that things are better than we were? We know that this thing has actually improved. Actually, it has made us to improve in terms of our utilization of technology. Now, for this particular meeting, we would have been in some hotel somewhere, but you can see as a result of technology, we are able to still continue with the meeting. So the issue of deepening of technology has gone up. And of course, we believe that based on the sustainability measures that different organizations may be able to put in place, then we will be able to realize some improvements in productivity. So I really don't want to say that everything is negative, but in the overall, when you look at it in terms of employment, the number of people who have lost jobs is higher than the number of people who may have gained jobs. I want to say, Bwana Odanga, that there is some gender dynamics in this. When we talk about the employment loss and we are giving the numbers in aggregate terms, then we really need to know that when you come to formal employment, up to slightly below 33% of workers in formal employment are women. When you come to the people who are on casual contracts of service, then up to 34% of them are women. When you come to people who are on part-time employment, then up to 62% of them are women. But also when you go to the informal sector, you will find that up to 53% of owners of those particular enterprises and even workers in those particular enterprises are actually women. So then it means that there is disproportionate effect of COVID-19 on men and women in the context of the labor market. And therefore, if, for example, like the issue of the containment measures that we have put in place that says that people don't go to work, and remember, people who are on casual contracts of service, they provide their labor services for a day. And that means that if they are not able to go to work, it also means that there is that particular employment loss and the income loss. So if you look at it in terms of the proportion of women who are on casual contracts of service, then we can really appreciate that there is some disproportionate effect on women. And if you were to look at it in terms of the people who are on part-time, and we are saying that up to 62% of women are, the proportion of women in part-time employment constitutes 62% of the total, then it means that those who are on part-time employment and therefore they have further reduction in the hours of work, or there is total reduction in the number of hours that they can put in, then you can see that, yes, women may have suffered more than men. I fully agree with you that informal sector has always been our labor sponge, and there is a lot of resilience in the informal sector. But remember, here is a situation whereby we are also talking about an informal sector with very limited vertical growth, with also very limited vertical linkages with medium and large enterprises. Of course, there is a lot of horizontal linkages that goes on, but I want to look at it in the context of the high mortality rates within the informal sector. Yes, I want to submit that COVID-19 may actually make more informal sector enterprises to die off. And therefore, with the resilience that it has, I see a reduction in this particular capacity. Then, Agustin, you have asked a very important question, that is there a possibility that employers can postpone recruitment? The answer I can say is yes, for majority of them, but depending on the space in which they are. But then, is there a possibility that an employer can withdraw a job offer? I want to understand your question in the context that maybe you had just gone through an interview, you had been given a letter of an employment offer, and you were told to report at a certain date, but before you reported, then the COVID-19 came up, and therefore companies had to shut down, or organizations had to shut down. So then you are asking that if we were to resume, would they still be able to consider you or not? I think this will very much depend on the cash flow situation of the organization. Remember that when things get to normalcy, not all organizations will pick up at the same time. There will be some lag in terms of picking up. I imagine that for public sector institutions that are actually getting funding from the government, they are likely to pick up almost immediately. But for private sector institutions, who by now we can actually appreciate the fact that some of them are going on to pay salaries and wages for their full-time employees, but even without meaningful work, those organizations may take time to recover. But even for us as individuals, we as the people who are consuming the goods and services that are produced by these organizations, I don't think that our consumption pattern would just pick up immediately. So in the period of that particular adjustment, there are certain organizations that may slow down picking up the job applicants whom they had already identified. Some of them may actually slow down in terms of recalling back the people whom they had sent on unpaid leave. Some of them may actually rethink of sending some people on early retirement. Remember, in my earlier presentation, I had indicated that up to 100 firms have already given a notice of to declare redundancies. So that one, I don't see it being recalled almost immediately, even if people were to resume. Thank you, Jackie.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Omolo. Now we go to John. John, please respond to the questions that were addressed to you.
Okay, thanks, Jackie, and thanks to the participants for those questions and comment. I'll start off with the last one that was addressed to me on. I don't remember the person who did that, but it's on tax. It's on leakages. So in terms of addressing or sealing leakages, of course, this calls for different. So there's no one silver bullet towards addressing issues of or sealing leakages. This will call for a combination of things, largely administrative, use of technology, and the like. Now, of course, in terms of leakages, we've seen stories in the papers of some of the people who've been taken to court for evading for tax evasion. But I believe the one thing that may, and studies actually show that may maybe reduce some of this evasion of tax and the like, is to increase compliance. And compliance is actually, there's a positive correlation between compliance and people seeing the taxes that they pay translating into service delivery. So if government put a lot of effort towards that, then that would increase compliance and reduce evasion. But no doubt, of course, there's need to combine, of course, administrative as well as enforcement and technology to seal leakages, but at the same time, just trying to simplify the tax codes, and which is what the National Treasury, KRA have been doing. So there are certain ongoing reforms towards addressing this, as well as, of course, governance-related issues that lead to leakages, corruption, and the like. So this requires a multifaceted approach. Yeah, but at the same time, for instance, in terms of technology, and there's need to ensure that we don't get into overregulation, because we've had overregulation and implementation of policies that may, in turn, may be counterproductive. For instance, the IEA did a study related to the effects of excise stamp management on alcoholic beverages, and whether that actually translated or is translating into increased revenue. And what we found is that there are challenges around that it's not necessarily translating into increased revenue. So there is need to balance use of technology and regulation towards addressing, for instance, leakages. Then from Wahisi has asked a couple of questions. One related to the issue of fiscal consolidation. No doubt, in this period, there's actually a relaxation in terms of meeting the fiscal consolidation target of 6.3 because expenditure or spending by government will actually go up. Of course, revenue collection will actually decline. And this will obviously have an effect in terms of service delivery as well as realization of some of the Big Four projects. So basically what it means is that there is need to better prioritize in terms of which projects to and put more focus, for instance, on any of the Big Four projects that are ongoing. So that's where the focus should be. But at the same time, there is need to continue to rationalize our expenditure and put more focus on that. So whether it's on the recurrent revenues or expenditure side, as well as on the development side. So on the development side, some of these projects will have to be not only in the Big Four, but some of them will have to be deferred until the situation normalizes or improves economically. Whereas on the recurrent expenditure side, some of the things that had already been mentioned, like for instance, job freezes and the like, will have to be enforced, just to ensure that we live within our limits as much as possible. Then on the reversal, so what I mean is, of course, currently we have these tax relief measures, but and maybe this is of course a challenge to the government because you don't know when the situation will improve, and of course this virus or disease may be with us for some time, so it's not clear whether how temporary or short term these measures are. So there's need for some more thinking around this and just some policy to provide clarity around that. But we're also saying that we may need to review these relief measures when the situation improves. Because if we continue with this, we'll probably I mean, of course, certain models will have to be done and simulations to see whether the reliefs are actually translating, for instance, to increased consumption and the like. But there is need for clarity around this in terms of just providing some kind of a sunset clause or a period of how long this will run, but also some studies or an assessment to see or analyze the need to reverse some of these measures, especially when the situation improves. Then the final one, on public debt, and it's actually tied. I think there are two people who asked questions that are related on public debt. So of course, restructuring is one of the, recommendations that I think Kwame also made that. So there are different ways of doing this. One is just to discuss, especially with our bilaterals, in terms of lengthening the maturity period, or what is called the tenure period. So that's one of the ways. But at the same time, there's need to ensure that we put proper debt management structures in place, but also enhancing oversight from Parliament and transparency around issues of debt. And probably there's also need to look at the issue we had that ceiling had been the debt ceiling had been expanded, so there's need to contract that. That will also help in terms of oversight and in terms of keeping the government in check with regard to borrowing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. We go now to Kwame. Kwame, you can respond to the few. I think there was one or two questions addressed.
Okay, I'll respond to one question by Odanga, and he's asking about keeping the vulnerable away. Yeah, it's true. I think the peculiar thing about the COVID-19 emergency is that young people are comparatively less affected in terms of basically the illness, but they're the major spreaders. So for that reason, keeping older citizens away from social places, possibly important for the purposes of reducing mortality, but keeping younger people to continue with social distancing is essential to ensure that it does not spread among them and doesn't spread among others. So yes, that's why I say that we need a more innovative policy. So if we are able to keep older people away, and part of that is my view is that it's possible for government. I know there's a tight position in terms of funds. It's possible for government to provide an incentive for people who are older to stay home. In my calculation, there are less than 3 million of them, of people who are 65 and above, based on the last census. So it's possible to actually support them and make sure that they keep home for at least 3 months. So what do you do with the younger ones? And for the younger people, that's why I say providing an incentive for younger people to actually test. Because if you test people, you're able to find who's at risk and whether they are risk to their colleagues at work and whether they are risk to people in their households. So that too would be helpful. And to bring that on, you could provide an incentive, a separate incentive for people actually to test, because I think our testing is too slow. Government says we have a resident testing capacity of 47,500 per day, 37,500 per day. And we've just tested about 40,000 people, which means we've exhausted only the equivalent of 1 day's test over the 60 plus days. So that's too slow. And the problem with that is it means that the virus is always ahead of us. Infections are always ahead of us. So for as long as the infections are ahead of us, we can use words such as flattening the curve, and we haven't flattened. So I think we need to open work. People are anxious to go, but it would be extremely dangerous to open schools and to ask people to continue to congregate in places before we know what stage of the infections we are in. And it's this moment with 37,000 tests, 43,000 tests, it's too little data, and especially its distribution to tell what the movements are. So I think it's a bit too early to be able to do that. But a testing capacity, to ramp up testing capacity would be useful. And so I'll give another incentive, which is my view is that, look, in the scope of events, as we showed you, that we'll be losing equivalent to about this year alone, based on the best case and the second one, the losses would be close to about 300 billion, actually 400 billion, heading towards 500 billion. If you think of that as a loss, it is worth spending 1 billion shillings of that 500 billion to actually try and capture the tests to be able to actually use a preventive measure that allows you. So if you put 1 billion as a prize and ask any farm in Kenya or any laboratory and tell them, if you are able to provide for us a test that is quick to administer and quick in terms of result, there's a prize of 1 billion shillings that will be available for government to spend on that. I know that's not how we think about incentives, but that's how economists think about incentives. It would be extremely effective. And we can lift our testing capacity from 2,000 per day today to actually something like 20,000 or even 100,000 per day. We will be catching up with the virus. As it is right now, we've been lucky, whether it's because of the weather, the temperatures, or even the social distancing has helped. I am not too sure we have an accurate view about how fast and how widely the virus has traveled. And that is really, really a worry. So yes, keeping older people because of the risk to their health immediately. The people with comorbidities would also be identified. And if you identify the people with comorbidities, we know that one of the things you need to do is to ensure that the best healthcare goes to people who are most at risk. Younger people, less so for this moment. And that lack that we have in terms of our demographic profile, we need to use it as we design policy, as opposed to designing policy as if we were in New York, which has a completely different risk profile from us. But the big thing that Kenya needs to do and put money on right now is testing. And my view about private sector is, even as they're thinking about trying to reopen, and as they're pushing a lot of money to government in terms of the COVID emergency fund through donations, my view is that they actually should establish a fund and ensure that we are able to ramp up testing to about 1 million tests per week. Only then will we be able to, because it's clear to me now, just like many medical people say, we are going to have to be living with the with the SARS virus, the SARS coronavirus 2, which causes COVID, for a long time. And the way to actually do that is to have very accurate information about how vast and how fighters travel, so that in the next 21 days, as we think about whether to extend the curfew or not, and I think people will be getting tired, it's important for us to use any extensions or any adjustments to policy based on what this data tells us. So that's definitely the thing. I think on fiscal consolidation and speaking about the debt situation, it's clear that in the circumstances in which we have suffered 2 shocks. Incomes will reduce because jobs are being reduced. And at the same time, companies are laying off people. So their profits will be affected and revenues to government will be affected. And at the same time, government will need to spend more in terms of the mitigation measures. So obviously fiscal consolidation for the time being would have to be kicked back into the future. And that's why a quick recovery is essential. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kwame. And our other 2 speakers, we go to a second round of questions. Kindly raise your hand if you have a question to help me queue them. I see Kefa is back. Kefa, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, good afternoon. Sorry, network had issues. I'll just go forward with the question. One to Jacob, one to Kwame. Jacob is the casualization of jobs, where we are seeing more jobs through the informal sector other than the informal sector. Is this a trend you would expect COVID-19 to actually accelerate? And first, what do you find fundamentally being the problem? Because again, we can't put it on COVID that most of our formal jobs are disappearing. And how then can we help safeguard the SME sector? What would some of the policies we would put in place to shape the performance of this sector, since most of Kenyans will then have to eke a living from there? And then to Kwame, this is on bailouts. They've been suggested bailouts to certain sector. I think tourism CS, Balala has been speaking on the same. And my question is, how do we rate which sectors to give bailouts? Some people have been complaining that tourism doesn't deserve in terms of its contribution to GDP. What should be the best criteria to look at offering bailouts to certain sectors of the economy? Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Kefa. I don't see any other hand. Does anyone else have a question? I'm giving an opportunity for 2 more questions. Yes, Victor. Victor Aduda.
Hello. Yes, how are you?
Yes, you can proceed.
Yeah, my name is Victor Aduda from Dock Workers Union. My question is to Dr. Molo and Kwame, maybe. What do you think should be the best strategy going forward for trade unionists, especially now that some of us have not yet negotiated our CBAs? What will be our best approach? Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Our panelists have noted the question. Anyone else with a question?
Hello.
Yes. Anyone else?
Hello.
I don't see who is speaking.
Hello.
Okay, Jairus, you can proceed. Yes, please proceed to ask your question.
Okay, thank you. The question is to John. He indicated that the pie tax reduction is basically on the band of 30 to 25%, which captures majorly the high income earners. I wanted to establish what could have informed this, because in itself it appears regressive rather than progressive in nature. Maybe you can enlighten on what could have informed this measure. Then the second one goes to Kwame. In his recommendations or in his policy options that he has given, when I look at the first 3, it would involve a lot.
Sorry, have we lost Jairus? Hello.
Looks like Jairus is muted.
Jairus, you can unmute your mic.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, now you can hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Yeah, I was saying that from the presentation given by Kwame, looking at his first 3 recommendations, it appears that they would involve a lot of financial implications on the government. Yet the government is already stressed in terms of finance. I was just wondering whether this would be possible in the short term to ensure a quick rebound like he suggests. Thank you.
Okay. I'll ask our panelists to respond to the questions, and we'll start with John. John, please respond to the questions addressed to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. So I just had one question from Jairus about the top rate taxpayers. That reduction from 30 to 25%. I'm not sure what informed this, but I think the idea was for, I mean, the issue of reducing the tax rate, whether it's for especially for the people who earn 24,000 and below, making it actually 100% relief is, of course, to increase disposable income and to ensure that they are cushioned during this period. But for the top tax rate payers, I think maybe they had similar objective of just increasing disposable income. But again, if you compare this to what would be lost, and the studies actually show that the benefit of this is actually falling on the top income earners. So it's not a tax that is equitable. So it actually goes against the principles of good taxation. And looking at it from a cost-benefit perspective, it's not an advisable way of designing this tax. But I guess, yeah, what informed it is just basically to increase disposable income and in turn increase consumption, which again may translate to collection of income through VAT. I think that was the idea. But again, studies show that it was not well designed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Dr. Omolo?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, let me start with Kefa's question about the issue of casualization of jobs. Kefa, you are right that we cannot actually blame the issue of casualization of jobs to COVID-19 because we've had casualization before. From the graph that I projected, you could see that even within the formal sector, there is some proportion slightly below 1/3 of total formal sector employment that is on casual contract of service. Then over time, we have also been having this piece rate. In fact, let me just put it that these are now coming in as the new forms of employment. Increasingly, organizations and even countries are moving away from what we used to call permanent and pensionable employment. You may have heard just last year, our government indicated that with effect from July this year, and I don't know if it will happen, government employees would be put on fixed-term contracts of service. The issue of outsourcing on and even subcontracting, which goes up to multi-layer subcontracting, is now the order of the day. So I really do not want to indicate that we are having the issues of casualization as a result of COVID. These are coming in as new forms of employment, as organizations get better ways, look at ways to remain competitive. Then I also want to indicate, as you have mentioned, that the informal sector has been hard hit, actually. And of course, besides the fact that there are interruptions in the supply chain due to COVID, they have always been having constraints to do with markets. They have been having constraints with local competition, licensing issues, and also the issue of poor infrastructure. So adding to this, then in the medium term, if we were to respond in terms of helping them due to COVID, then the most important thing here is actually keeping or ensuring that the informal sector workers are safe and healthy. So that means that besides the masks, besides the sanitizers and all these other things, then occupational safety and health measures would be more intense in the informal sector. Then, of course, you know that as much as the government put in place mechanisms to do cash transfers under the social protection scheme, not many informal sector operators and workers have received this. So the issue of cash transfers and even food subsidies would be very important. But of course, we also know that the enterprises are not able to sustain, and therefore are thinking about wage subsidies to sustain the people who are in employment, and also temporary credit transfers to sustain liquidity would be important. But overall, actually, access to health and healthcare services is very important. Even as we talk about the issue of long-term measures that would ensure comprehensive social protection, how the government at national and county levels could relax the licensing requirements, how we can support marketing, promotion, and also innovation, and providing the enabling environment. Now, Victor, your question is interesting, that yes, we are in the face of this, but we still have trade unions, and we still have the aspect of collective bargaining. And there are organizations and unions whose collective bargaining agreements are just coming to an end. And therefore, what would be the thing to do before we go for negotiations? I think, in my view, the starting point would be for us to do an assessment of the specific companies that we are talking about. Like in your case, you are talking about the Kenya Ports Authority, which, of course, you as an insider, you might know it better. But in my understanding, I think their turnover may have also gone down because of the scaling down of the business activities that they have. So it would be important for you to actually understand the extent to which this particular organization has been affected. Because remember, part of the parameters that are considered when you are talking about any wage awards is the issue of the ability to pay and the capacity of the enterprise to sustain the increased labor costs. So that would be one. But I would also want to suggest that kindly let us relook at our collective bargaining agreements and see the kind of clauses that we have. My view is that there are very important clauses in your collective bargaining agreement which are non-monetary in nature. And with the kind of emergency that we have, and even in future, they can provide a much better protection to your colleagues than an increase in salaries, let us say, by 10%. So my approach would be, besides looking at the performance of your organization, can we for one time now not focus too much on salary increments, because we know there will be a lot of rigidity in terms of even the government accepting increment in salary. Can we target the non-monetary clauses in our CBA which we believe may provide better benefit for our members. One thing that I have in mind, for example, and people have seen this, is that in the counting that people are making here, is that we have been 60 plus days with COVID. So you are not going to work for 60 days. But you see, maybe your sick leave, as per the collective bargaining agreement, maybe 14 days, or it could be statutory one of 7 days, or it could be 21 days. What if we could get a way of increasing that? What if we could actually look at strengthening our redundancy process and also the surveillance package that we get? So mine would be to say that let us do some background assessments, but before you really focus on monetary issues, check if we can also have the non-monetary issues in our CBA, which we could take up and go on with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kwame?
Thanks, Jackie. I think there's just two questions. One is from Victor, no, from Kefa. The first is, how do we rate which sectors to give bailouts? My view is that an economy is such a complex system. I don't call it a machine, but it's such a complex system that it's not clear which systems. My view right now is that government should, as much as possible, be trying to save employment. And what that means is employment exists in certain sectors. So we shouldn't choose on the basis of GDP alone by saying that this occupies this part of GDP and therefore it should be. I don't think that would be the right way. The way would just be to ask which enterprises employ which number of people, and that's where the Lifeline Fund would come in. Because if you have a Lifeline Fund, what you establish is you provide that money by government guarantees to banks, and then everybody who thinks that they are required or they qualify should then apply and negotiate that with banks. Remember two things: banks have an interest in lending, but at the same time, they can conduct the due diligence in a way that government cannot. So anybody who thinks they need that facility would then apply. It's not free money. It's money that's allowing them to be able to survive, even if it means they can only pay part of the wages, but to keep the farm in place so that as soon as the rebound starts, they don't have to go back again to rehire people, or they will not find that a few of the people that they had as employees have shifted from Nairobi and gone somewhere else, and then that raises their costs. So the most important thing is to keep in place as much as possible the capacity so that as soon as the economy is ready to go, many farms are not starting from scratch all over again. So we shouldn't choose. I don't think the argument about it, you understand why Honorable Balala would be interested, Cabinet Secretary Balala would be interested, because that's the industry runs, so you don't expect him to say that it's not. But all I'm trying to say is government should put together a facility, establish some rules for a farm that has been there, has adhered, its tax payments and its adherence to regulations have been up to scratch. That money will be distributed through banks, and banks can conduct the due diligence and make sure as much as is possible that the money can be disbursed within a week. This happened in the US as well. There were delays, but the point is we don't have time. And every single day that we waste means some specific farms will not be able to recover. That's the most important thing, so that they can keep their payments going, because one person's income is another person's payment as well, because they pay for a service or they're able to buy. So that connectedness of the economy tells me that trying to choose whether it's tourism or the others or not. And you know about tourism, obviously. Tourists are not coming back, especially the international kind, because of flights and everything else. Tourists are not going to come back immediately, especially if we don't have a vaccine ready, or if most of the other countries have not actually achieved what is called herd immunity. So I would not go by virtue of choosing beforehand which sector. I would go by virtue of which farms are there and which ones need the most help. And if their owners are prepared to take on that risk, then they can be provided with funds which are like loans, soft loans, but which allow them to actually be able to invest in and to keep their employees going ahead. Then what's the strategy to trade unionists, to Victor? I think trade unionists have to understand two things. A shock like this is both an opportunity, but it's also basically a significant risk. And the risk side is if you push wage payments at this time and to calculate CBAs at this time, when farms have no money, then it will give them the good excuse to actually cut down by claiming that they cannot afford. And in a position where there's a shock in the economy, what that does is that they can push down, they can actually let people go and hire other people at a cheaper rate. So the point is at this time, yes, CBAs are important. They have to be negotiated on the basis of as much flexibility available to both sides. So yes, I think keep your CBA idea in mind, but you know that this is not an employer's market. I mean, this is not an employee's market. It's actually an employer's market, but an employer is also suffering from a shock in revenues. So any type negotiating which is inflexible will actually lead the employer to try and save their money by actually even closing a farm or delaying employment as much as is possible. So as much as is possible, it is essential for trade unionists to understand why a lifeline fund is required, managed in a transparent system, because part of that money will be your taxes, which you'll pay in future. So it's essential for you to call upon the government to ensure that we have a lifeline fund going quickly, as other countries have done, very, very, very quickly, but only available to firms that are able to negotiate and have also been adhering to specific regulations so that that money is not absorbed entirely by the firm, but is also used to cover and to cushion employees for a share of their income. The final one is by Jairus about the financial position. Now, if you look at page 7 of the presentation that we made, you can look at it later. And in it is this table talking about the scenarios for medium losses in the medium term. And what we calculated was what the losses would be. Now, a slow rebound would lead to losses equivalent to 4.2 trillion, which is 37% of, close to 40% of GDP last year. Now, what that tells you is that irrespective of what government needs to do, it needs a smart program that allows it as much as possible to get a quick rebound. And a quick rebound might mean expanding the deficit, because spending has to be maintained. Some kind of spending has to be maintained. It has to cut unnecessary expenditure, but at the same time, it has to keep farms in a way that allows for the rebound to take place as quickly as possible. Now, the point I emphasize is that it would have been easier if the economy had been managed well, and we did not have all this debt overhang and those, last mile policies and the SGR that were invested in that have not released their own value, and they probably never will. So what I'm trying to say is that a shock is something that you don't see. Economists know that shocks come, but you weather those shocks if your economy was in a good position to begin with, and your principles of public budgeting and public expenditure, your fiscal policy in general, was managed sensibly. We have not, and that's what's going to make it even more painful. But it's even more painful at the same time that we need government to actually expand the public budgets, the public balance sheet. You have very little scope because we are indebted. So what that leads us is those debt payments that are due this year and the year after for the next 3 years will probably have to be renegotiated to expand their tenure so that the amount of money the government is spending on debt, we buy some relief, some 300-400 billion would be essential, and then we can use that money to support other enterprises. But the point is this: the losses that would occur and the difference between a quick rebound and a solid and a slow rebound is such a big share of the economy that government cannot afford to be constrained entirely by the fact that we have debt. So yes, unfortunately, this is not something the IEA agrees with, but this is a moment where government would be in its right to actually expand the debt and expand it by a big margin, because it will definitely pay off. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kwame. Before we are almost concluding now, but before I ask our speakers to give their closing remarks, I'll give an opportunity for one last person. If there's anyone who had anything that they wanted to ask, any burning comments, question, any last person? Going once, going twice? Okay, so in the absence of that, I'll ask our speakers I'll give them just less than a minute to give their closing remarks before I come in and close. And we'll start with Dr. Omolo. Just give us your closing remarks in under a minute, please.
Yes, two things. One is the ability for us to have more comprehensive social protection systems would be important in the event of any other emergency like the one we are having now. Number two is that the labor market will definitely adjust as a result of adjustments in the economy after COVID, but let's be sure that it will be relatively slower than expected, and therefore we need some other adjustment mechanisms to be made. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I must say I found this very useful and very profound in the sense that it showed how connected, how these three issues of the effect of COVID on employment, revenues, or fiscal side of fiscal policy and growth, how all these things are connected. It was quite profound. So it's as much as I know it, but it felt, I mean, it was really quite profound. My closing remarks is that we are currently putting together the numbers, crunching the numbers in our analysis of the budget, and we'll have more insights on this and probably have another webinar to just discuss related stuff, but on more on the budget here. And we will, of course, publicize this in our social media, so look out for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. And finally, Kwame, your closing remarks.
Okay, thanks a lot. To start with my presentation, which I think is fantastic, just like the others. I was helped in that presentation together with Leo Kemboi, my colleague at the IES. I think he needs to get the credit for that as well. Thanks a lot. But I think I'll stress two things. What still makes me nervous at this point is if we are not testing, then it's not possible for us to know. Because the shock, we have had to crash the economy or to keep the economy in coma in order to manage the spread and to prevent a surge, which would cause many more deaths. So obviously what we are doing is it is essential, and we don't blame government for asking us to stay home. However, if we don't take advantage of people staying at home to make sure that we understand what the trajectory of this illness is, then we'll have wasted the 6 or 7 weeks that we've kept people home. And it means that our ability to recover faster would actually be affected. So the best scenario is for us to try as much as possible to get a fast recovery. And we've seen what its best are, and government isn't doing. So if you ask me to two things, the Lifeline Fund is essentially should be established like yesterday. And we really need to ramp up tests. And I think the only way we do that is for government to provide a facility, an economic incentive for laboratories and researchers, whether internal or external, to be able to conduct something like 100,000 to 200,000 per day and to be able to turn those tests. Because the problem is a test takes 2 days to come back often, and that doesn't give you as much. So if we can hasten the amount of time it takes to get a test and the number of tests altogether, we'll get a far greater far greater control of this. And then with confidence, sitting at the IEA or all other the people who are investors and making people come to work, you can be confident that if you ask your colleagues to come to work, you could even pay for those tests to be taken so that you're sure that all your colleagues are not infecting each other. And that will be much, much easier. And our trajectory back would be, because we really need a fast growth. We can tell what the opportunity cost of a slow growth is. Of a slow rebound is. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kwame. And I'd like now to close this meeting. And mine is just to thank all the speakers from Dr. Omolo, John Mutua, and Kwame Owino. Thank you. All your presentations were brilliant. So we appreciate the effort in preparing them. I'd like to state that they'll be available on IEA's website after this meeting. Our communications office will work on making sure they are uploaded as soon as possible. So if you'd like to access them, you can. I'd also like to thank all the participants, all of you who are able to join us here today. I see we still have, many of you are still here, so thanks a lot for your participation and useful contribution to the meeting. John has already stated that they are working on numbers for this, and also these discussions here will be synthesized further, and we'll have a sort of policy brief documenting the discussions here today, and that will also be shared separately from the presentations that will be uploaded. So on behalf of the IEA, we thank you very much, and we wish you a good day. Thanks, bye. You're free now to leave.